Good evening, everyone. Ian Patrick here, and tonight we are looking at another Charles Dickens movie. We've already watched Nicholas Nickleby, great movie. We've watched, I believe, A Christmas Carol, and I watched Oliver Twist not too long ago, David Lane's. However, sorry, I didn't review it. You all already know I love the David Lane Dickens films, Oliver Twist, and Great Expectations. But tonight we are looking at one I've never seen before that came out in 1935, and it is David Copperfield. David Copperfield, George Cukor's David Copperfield, the great director. And we know he did Gaslight and countless other great classics. And this was an MGM picture that our man David O. Selznick happened to produce. And I don't know why, but for some reason Selznick pictures always end up being on my watch list, and I swear I don't look for Selznick movies and check them off the list. It's just I always, for some reason, watch Selznick movies. Now, as I said, this came out in 1935. It had a great cast. It was Freddie Bartholomew's first Hollywood picture. And we have W.C. Fields and Lionel Barrymore, Maureen O'Sullivan. I'm just going to go down the list. Elsa Lanchester has a small role in this. I always like to note her because she was a great character actor. Basil Rathbone, great actor. Edna May Oliver. Frank Lawton plays adult David Copperfield. And also Jessie Ralph. I note her because she played Peggotty, who I loved in this movie. This movie was nominated for Best Picture in 1935, along with A Tale of Two Cities, another Dickens film that Selznick produced. I'm sure we'll get to watching A Tale of Two Cities one of these days. It was nominated, but it didn't win. Louis B. Mayer, Selznick's father-in-law of MGM, he actually was against filming this. He thought, classics, they are purists will think that we strayed too far away from the book, and people who don't know the story will fall asleep. Well, he was wrong, because this movie was a great success. Now, I will mainly talk about Freddie Bartholomew's part because it's a little more than half of the movie, because this half was much better than the second half, in my opinion. And that's okay to think that, because according to George Cukor, who someone said to him, hey, I think the second half isn't as good as the first, Cukor said, that's okay, because that's the same way in the book. The first half is better too. And you got to admit that a Dickens film would be very difficult to put in 2 hours. So let's get into it. Freddie Bartholomew plays our young David Copperfield. The story takes place in 1820s England, a lot in London and other big cities in England at the time. And we learn quickly that he's a boy who only has a mother. His father has passed away, and apparently his father was a very loving man. And Freddie Bartholomew, he's such a cute little kid. He's very kind and has a loving relationship with his mother and Peggotty, played by Jessie Ralph. And Peggotty is like the housemaid, and he always comes to Peggotty for different things. But we learn quickly that Freddie Bartholomew, young David's mom, is looking at remarrying. And of course, she's looking at a young, handsome man who's played by Rathbone. And he is a man with sinister intentions. He basically is very sweet to his mother at first, but once they are married, he's awful to David. He basically doesn't want any love in the household, and it's like all the love and brightness in the house has been sucked out of it once she married him. And Rathbone was so good at his character. He was almost too good, because apparently he didn't want people to think that he was really such an evil guy, because he would always go off and during the creating of the film, he would be super nice to young Freddie Bartholomew offset, and he would want pictures taken with him and Freddie of him being nice with Freddie so people wouldn't think he was such an awful person, because in the movie he was really bad. In fact, there's a scene where he whips young David really hard, and Freddie Bartholomew's acting is so good. His crying in this scene, and just the feeling that he wants to be loved, and he gets locked up in a scene where his mom is giving birth, and he's screaming out, Peggotty, someone get me out of here so I can see if my mom's okay giving birth. And it's sad because his mother does end up dying, which basically makes him an orphan. And the only person in the world that he has that he feels like loves him is Peggotty, and Peggotty then goes away. So Basil Rathbone is awful to him, continues to be awful, and he says, look, I'm going to send you to London to work. So he sends him off to London, where he meets W.C. Fields for the first time. W.C. Fields plays Micawber. Micawber, such a great name. Really, Dickens had such a way with coming up with great names, but Micawber is an interesting character, very poor, owes money to lots of people. You sort of get like a con man vibe from him, but sweet man, very good to young David. Eventually David has to go away because he can't stay with Micawber, and Micawber says to him, you should go with your aunt, young David. Go be with your aunt. And it's funny because Micawber has a way of always saying, in short, da-da-da-da. And we'll talk more when I have a lot of history to cover with this movie, but we'll talk more about W.C. Fields speaking with an English or American accent in this movie. It's a little out of place, but it works because W.C. Fields played the role very well. So he goes to his aunt's house, who's played by Edna May Oliver, Aunt Betsy, and he goes on this long, just awful walk, and we see his clothes getting torn up. He's in rain and just awful conditions, and you just feel so much anguish and so much sadness for young David, because he's just this little kid, and he's going on like a couple days worth of walking to get to Aunt Betsy's, and he breaks down when he gets to her, because at first she wants nothing to do with him because he's a boy. But you grow. Honestly, I would have to say I loved Aunt Betsy maybe more than any character in the movie besides young David, because she eventually does just fall in love with young David, because it's her dead sister's little boy. And at some point she has to give an amazing speech to Basil Rathbone, basically saying, you get away from my son. You brought so much, or my nephew, you brought so much sadness and hatred, not hatred, but sadness and depression into my dead sister's house. You treated him awful. I don't want you anywhere near David. And it was just one of the best speeches I've seen. And she basically says everything that we want to be said to him. She says everything we want to be said to Basil Rathbone, and you just feel great because he leaves and we don't see him for the rest of the movie. So then the movie gets bright again, and we feel like young David is back on track in life, and he's gonna go to London to learn how to be a young man, a gentleman, where he's going to learn basically the trade, how to read and write and do things in London with a family friend of Aunt Betsy. And he goes there, and I believe he's staying with lawyers, and he meets a little girl who they become friends, and of course later the little girl grows up with him. But they go there, and he meets a very sinister man, Uriah Heep, who at the time is just he isn't a partner in the firm, but we can sense there's something off about him, that he's plotting something. And later, because then we transition to the second half of the film, which has to do with David being grown up, and adult David is played by let me see, I forgot his name, Frank Lawton. And Frank Lawton was such a good actor. He was so good at I think being just as bright as young David was as Freddie Bartholomew, because they both are so cheery, so positive. In fact, that's one of the things, now that I think about it, that I like so much about David Copperfield, is how positive David always seems to be when he's had such a hard life. So now he's old, and we learn that he basically wants to be a writer, talk about his stories, and he eventually does meet, and he meets a beautiful young woman, Dora, at a theater, and she's perfect, she's cheerful. But it's interesting, he does end up marrying her, but he quickly learns that she's not very smart, she's not very bright, and she doesn't even know how to cook, and it annoys him. And I kind of understand his feelings and thoughts, because if you've ever been with someone who, they're beautiful, but then there's not much up there, you kind of want to change them, you want to make them smarter, but you can't you can't do that. So he quickly realizes that, I'm sorry, my love, for trying to change you, I shouldn't have done that. And it's beautiful how he realizes that. And then I think she has cancer, or just an awful illness, and she's passing away. And she's such a bright and cheerful character, kind of just like David, but even brighter. But she passes away, and it's very sad. And then towards the end of the movie, it goes back to Macabre saving the day, basically, because Uriah Heep is trying to manipulate his partner now, because now he's partners with this old man. He's trying to manipulate him, taking over the business, getting all the money. But Macabre saves the day when David comes, and they're able to get Uriah Heep out of the way, and there's a happy ending. And I'm sure I missed a lot of things in the story, but I have a lot of history I want to get to, and I don't want this review to be like an hour long. So I am going to give this movie a 3.5 stars. I think it was fairly long. However, my biggest complaint with the movie, the casting is just perfect. Notice I didn't even have to talk about Barrymore. Barrymore has a very small part in this, and usually Barrymore would carry the cast, but Barrymore didn't. Everyone, including little Freddie Bartholomew, just carried the movie. But the cast is perfect. The music was great. It was a little long, but I think the main issue was the second half. It started to get too choppy and keeping up with everything. But what do you expect with a Dickens novel trying to be pushed into a 2.5 or a 2-hour movie? In fact, Selznick thought about making this into 2 separate movies, to young David Copperfield and then old David Copperfield, but he scratched it. So the movie does get a little choppy towards the end. It's so close to being a perfect film. It's not, to me, though. Very close. And the very, very ending was abrupt, which you all know I hate when older movies end super abruptly in a goofy way. So I give it a 3.5 stars. I'll show you some pictures first. Well, let me read some history, and then we'll show some pictures, because I have a lot to talk about. So first, we'll start out with this great picture of W.C. Fields. Young David and W.C. Fields. So this was actually Selznick's favorite book. As a Russian lad newly arrived in England, it was his dad's favorite book. I apologize. His dad had helped himself to learn English with this book. So this was a very special story to David O. Selznick. David plunged ahead with the film version of David Copperfield despite the opposition of Louis Mayer, who claimed that such classics were poison at the box office. Unable to dissuade his son-in-law from undertaking the project, Mayer then urged the casting of MGM's popular child actor, Jackie Cooper, in the title role. David argued that it would be foolish to cast an American boy in the English classic, and he sent his director, George Cukor, to England in search of a youth to play the title role. Cukor returned with a winning young man, Freddie Bartholomew, which perfect casting. I love little Freddie Bartholomew now. After the filming of David Copperfield had begun, so they originally had cast Charles Lawton, and Charles Lawton was dropped. So I'm going to get into that now. Lawton was supposed to play W.C. Fields' character Macabre, but thankfully Lawton wasn't. So Lawton became uneasy with his role as the debt plagued Macabre. He asked to withdraw from the picture, and Selznick reluctantly agreed. I don't think that's right, because in the other books it sounds like Selznick wasn't buying into Charles Lawton's portrayal. It was a long chance to have W.C. Fields play him. Fields had never appeared in a dramatic picture, and there were fears that he might play his own comedic self instead of a Dickens character. Fields himself was dubious about the assignment, and he attempted to inject one of his standard routines, the juggling act. Reminded that Dickens made no mention of Macabre's juggling, the comedian replied, "He probably forgot it." David vetoed the juggling act as well as the pool table routine Fields tried to include, but David gave in when Fields refused to adopt an English accent. Quote, "My father was an Englishman, and I got this accent from him," Fields remarked on his nasal drawl. Are you trying to go against nature?" He spoke with the lines in his unique manner, though at a slightly slower pace. Fields had always mumbled his way through movies, often inventing his own dialogue. Selznick and Cukor insisted that he adhere to the Dickensian prose. Unable to remember the lengthy dialogue, Fields resorted to reading his lines from cue cards off camera. His readings became less polished as the filming day continued, since he was consuming 2/5 of whiskey daily. So when David assembled David Copperfield, the picture ran 2.5 hours. And at first people didn't like it, but let me get to where I want to talk about. A preview in Santa Ana drew an excellent reaction, but David was dissatisfied. He noticed 4 women in the lobby talking about it, and he approached them to ask what they thought of the picture. They were school teachers. Quote, "We loved the picture," one of them, "except for one thing," one of them said. How could you possibly film David Copperfield and not include Peggotty?" And they're talking about Barrymore's Peggotty character, not the female Peggotty. David smiled. "Next time you see the picture, he'll be in it." Lionel Barrymore was restored to the film because he had originally been cut out because the movie was too long. So they put him back in, and David completed it at the length of 2 hours and 13 minutes. Expectedly, the MGM sales force protested. "How long can it be?" demanded the company president, Nick Senk. "How long is good?" David replied. Critics and audiences alike pronounced David Copperfield good, and David Selznick proved to himself 2 important lessons. 1, don't tamper with a classic, and 2, don't worry about a picture's length as long as it's good, which would help him in the creation of Gone with the Wind, of course. So let me show you these amazing pictures and my best. This is like my best book I think I own. Oh, it's very heavy. So here you can see the set of the church. Over here, So you can see pictured there Selznick when they went to England with George Cukor. They were checking out the sites and looking for their young star actor, which they eventually found. There's the cast all together with Selznick. Oh man, this book is very, very heavy. Here's an interesting scene that was cut out from the movie where he daydreams about Dora and being with her. And eventually you can see that stupid little Dora. I'm so glad they cut that out. And then here, more scenes from the movie. Oh man, this is heavy. So the movie cost a little over $1 million to make. That was the budget that was given to Selznick, and it grossed $3.5 million in the U.S. alone. So it was a huge hit, which boosted Selznick's career. So let me read this little bit about Charles Lawton. In mid-October, Charles Lawton reported to the studio to begin his scenes as Macabre, a role in which Cukor said, quote, he didn't want to do, but had been persuaded. He came to the set and he had a most marvelous makeup. He'd shaved his head and he looked perfect for it. We shot for 3 or 4 days and then Lawton withdrew. This was not entirely unexpected on Selznick's part, for he had been unhappy with Lawton's work. Hal Kern said, quote, Lawton looked as if he was going to molest the child. So they didn't think that he was a good fit. A lot of people were worried that W.C. Fields wouldn't be able to play the part well. American guy playing in a Charles Dickens picture might ruin the entire film, but really he did an excellent job. So I'm going super far. I had a lot more I wanted to read, but really I don't want this review to be too long. Here's another picture of them when they went overseas, George Cukor and Selznick. So let's see. So they got to take many, we photographed Betsy Trotwood's house and the White Cliffs of Dover. But we shot the Dover scenes in California near Malibu, and I have to say our cliffs were better, wider and cliffier. So it was in New York later that summer that David met the 10-year-old Freddie Bartholomew, an English boy on vacation. David Jack Holt had been in running for the part, but Selznick was won over immediately by Bartholomew's, quote, charming in personality and distinctly English manner of speech. Freddie's aunt had put him up for the role, but his parents were against show business, and there were difficulties about bringing him and an English child to work. David was on the point of sending Freddie home until a friend reported that London Home Office had said the matters was out of its jurisdiction. The boy was reclaimed from the ship in New York, or so David said, and thus Cukor had the angelic face that would be observer and conscious to the action. So, very, very thankful. I have that Freddie Bartholomew played the part. I have more to talk about, but I don't want this to go on too long. Now, I will mention what Cukor said about the picture. He said about filming it, it was a difficult thing making these people funny and frightening at the same time. You achieve it partly by the casting, but also by deciding on the style of playing. I don't believe in, quote, correcting Dickens, saving him and all that. I just had to go with the vitality of the thing. And, I have to be honest, these movies are filmed in a much different style from the David Lane pictures and even Nicholas Nickleby. I prefer those ones. They're a little bit darker, I know, but this one is a much brighter film. Maybe the story itself, David Copperfield, is just a brighter story than those ones, Great Expectations, Oliver Twist. But highly recommend this movie. I almost gave it a perfect 4 out of 4. I think you all will love it. And let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to leave a like. Thank you.